In this lecture, we're going to be covering in more detail what are routes, views, controllers, and edit some code to display on the website. So the first thing we want to do is PHP artisan serve. Now we go into the browser, we refresh, and we have our test code. So basically, let's talk about what routes are. Here, as we did a route with the test code, now let's do a new route so we can get a better understanding. Say for example, we did something like dash contacts, and here we're gonna put something like contacts page, just to keep it simple, right? We're gonna copy this and come here, we're gonna do slash contacts, and as you can see, it says contacts page. So the whole idea and the basic idea behind the routes is that any route that you put here is going to execute the code that is inside here. And then there's more to it, as you can pass in parameters, you can pass in different things, but this is the basic idea. So all your different URLs, you might want to define them in this file. Also, there's not only the route get method, but you can do something like the post, or you can do something like put, or you can do a delete. You can even do something like any, so that any call gets executed, whether it's a get call, a post call, or a delete call, it doesn't matter. Right now we're gonna put it as get, so we can continue with our example. Now let's cover the topic of parameters. So for example, here you want to add something like a parameter. You would do it like this. Say for example, ID of something, it doesn't matter. And here, this means that whenever the user contacts this URL, they need to pass in the ID. So something like 12, for example, as an ID. Now, how do we obtain this ID? So we want to put here as a parameter, say for example it's a string, and we'll put it here, and then here we're going to put contacts page, and then we're also going to include the ID like this. So now that we display it, you will see that it says contacts page 12, because we're passing in a parameter from the URL into our route and then displaying it here as a parameter. So this is how you pass in parameters into the route. You can also have optional parameters. So right now this is a required parameter, so if I do something like pass nothing, you will say it's 404 not found. But say we want to make it an optional parameter. So the way to do that is that we would come here and we would put the question mark, meaning that it's optional. And then here we would put something like this, and then by default we'll make it a null. That way it becomes totally optional. And now once we save it and we refresh, you'll see that the page works because the parameter is optional. And now if we do pass it, say we put 99, it will show up like this. So this is how you put in optional parameters in your routes. You can even do very cool data validations in here. For example, if we want to make it so that the ID is a numeric value, we can do something like this. So now what we're doing with this is that we're telling it that the ID must be a number. That way you're forcing the user to make it into a number. So say I do something like, it's not gonna work. But if I do something like 23, it will work, because now this is forcing it so that it becomes a number. Now if I remove it, for example like this, it should be able to work as a string. So this is a new way of putting requirements to your parameters. This is I'm not sure if this is the ideal place where you would put it, but it's definitely a good to know option. Later, we will cover more about validation or validating your inputs, and that's where I would normally put it. Another cool thing you can do in the routes is that you can call a view directly, like how it was being done here, return view, or you can do it in a different manner. For example, you could do something like, let's create a new route, and for the sake of it, let's just call it test view. We don't need any of these. Now there's two ways to do it. Either you can do a return view welcome, right? Or you could do something like route view slash test view, and then as a second parameter we're gonna pass in the welcome, and that's it. That's all you would have to declare, like that. So now let's test it out. We refresh and we can still see it. So this is a nice way to invoke a view from a URL directly. So let's talk about views. For the views, okay, so let's take a look at views and how we can create them. So to create our own view so that we can use it in our route, first of all, let's put this back to how it was. Okay, now let's create a new view. Let's pause the server for a moment. So we're gonna do PHP artisan make view, and then we're gonna give it a name to our view. So let's call it context. Now we have created a context.blade.php, which is the default that Laravel uses. So now we're going to have a context.blade file here inside our views structure. So here, I'm just gonna uncomment this so that we know that we are on our context page. And now here on the get context, let's just remove the ID. Actually, let's use the function on top. And we're going to be returning that view called context. Let's run the server again. And here we get our quote that the biggest battle is the war against ignorance. So this is an easy way to show your views from your routes, and this is how we create new views using our command line. And it uses a blade.php extension, which is something that we're going to cover in future lectures, but it's basically like the template that Laravel uses to display HTML code. The next topic we're going to cover is the controllers. Why would you want to use controllers rather than views? Because sometimes you have a lot of logic happening before the actual HTML is rendered, like getting information from the user, etc. So you might want to use a controller, and the controller then calls the view, passing in the required parameters that it needs. So let's explore that. Here we have in our HTTP the controllers, and here we have a basic controller. So let's look at how to create a new controller and how to call it on the routes. So the next thing we're going to do is that we're going to create a controller and then call it from our route. So the way to do it is that we're going to do a PHP artisan make controller, and we're going to call it, for example, context controller. That's it. You created the context controller. If we go into our code, we're going to see it here, context controller. And now we're going to change our router so that it calls this context controller. How we would do that? We're going to change this function so that it now takes in an array. And the first thing we're going to call on the array is going to be the controller, context controller. Now we're going to call here the function that we're going to be creating inside our class. So let's call it something like show. Okay, one thing to remember that is really important is that here you have to include that controller. Now we're going to go into our controller, and here we're going to write a function called show. And in here we're going to be returning a view, which is basically our context view. And let's just change it and say something like call from a controller, so that we know it's updated text. And here we're going to return the view called context, and that's it. That should do it. So now if we refresh the page, hopefully we did everything right, and we should be able to be getting, of course we need to start the server. Oops. Call from a controller. So this is how you can call controller inside a router, and then inside the controller you would be calling your view, which is here. And the reason you do that is because, for example, you could have something like, say for example we had a bunch of functions, and they can be any text that you want, and they have similar logics, meaning that they each need to execute whatever code is in the controllers. And that's the reason why you would want to put it on a controller, because you can directly call the view and skip the controller itself, but the controller is going to help you put similar logic into the same place so that you don't have to repeat the code everywhere.